The colossal oak stood as a skeletal monument to a time before Ethan's world had fractured. Its gnarled branches, thick as a man's waist, clawed at a bruised twilight sky, cradling the ruin of his grandmother's treehouse. To anyone else, it was a splintered wreck, a dangerous relic sagging under the weight of a decade of neglect. But to Ethan, a hollowed-out man of 40, and his 7-year-old son, Leo, it was the last rung on a ladder that had run out of places to go. His German shepherd, Major, a constant warm pressure against his leg, seemed to understand. The dog knew this place held more than just rotten wood and shattered memories. He sensed a $500 million secret hidden within the decay, a secret that would force a broken soldier to either heal his oldest wounds or be buried by them forever. We bring you stories about the unbreakable bonds that can pull us from the darkest of times. If you believe in the power of loyalty and second chances, please support us by subscribing to our channel. We'd be honored to have you with us. Where are you listening from today? Let us know in the comments below. The air inside the treehouse was thick with the ghosts of disuse. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the weak beams of Ethan's flashlight, illuminating a scene of quiet dereliction. A small, wood-framed cot with a rotted mattress was shoved into one corner, and a single, grime-streaked window looked out into the deepening woods. The place smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the faint, sweet scent of cedar that had long ago surrendered to the damp. It was a tomb suspended between earth and sky. Ethan ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble, a familiar grating sound. Just 6 months ago he'd had a home, a wife, a life that made sense. Now he had a beat-up truck with a quarter tank of gas, a son whose eyes were too old for his face, and the deed to this forgotten patch of land his grandmother had left him, a woman he barely remembered. The money from the sale of their suburban house had evaporated, consumed by the mountain of medical debt Clara had left behind. Every dollar spent felt like another betrayal of her memory, a futile attempt to pay off the inevitable. Leo, small and silent, clutched a worn stuffed wolf, his gaze fixed on a dark stain on the floorboards. He hadn't spoken much since the funeral, communicating mostly through tight grips of his hand and the slight tremor in his shoulders. Ethan's heart, a leaden weight in his chest, ached with a familiar, corrosive guilt. He was a former Green Beret, a man trained to build, to protect, to lead his team through impossible odds. Yet he couldn't protect his own wife from the silent, cellular war that had consumed her. He couldn't protect his son from the aftermath. He had failed his most important mission. "It's just for a little while, buddy," Ethan murmured, the words tasting like ash. "We'll get it fixed up. It'll be an adventure." Leo didn't answer. He just hugged his wolf tighter. The lie was too thin, too brittle to cover the sharp edges of their reality. This wasn't an adventure. It was a retreat, a full-scale, disorganized rout from a life that had become unbearable. Major, however, seemed unconcerned with their bleak circumstances. The shepherd, his sable coat a patch of vibrant life in the gloom, began a low, intense whine. He wasn't looking at Ethan or Leo. His focus was entirely on a section of the floor near the far wall. His powerful body tensed, his head cocked. He padded over to the spot, his claws clicking softly on the dusty wood, and began to sniff with an unnerving focus, his tail giving a single stiff wag. Then he began to scratch, not playfully, but with a determined, rhythmic scraping that echoed in the oppressive silence. "Major, leave it," Ethan commanded, his voice flat. The dog paused, looked back at him with intelligent amber eyes, then let out a soft woof and returned to his task, his claws digging into the wood with renewed urgency. Ethan sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He didn't have the energy for this, for a dog's strange fixation. He just wanted to collapse, to let the darkness behind his eyes swallow him whole. But then he looked at Leo, who was now watching the dog, a flicker of curiosity in his wide, somber eyes. It was the first spark of interest Ethan had seen in weeks. That tiny spark was enough. It was everything. He knelt, his knees protesting as they met the hard floor, and ran his hand over the boards Major was so obsessed with. They felt solid, no different from the rest. But Major was insistent, nudging Ethan's hand with his wet nose, whining again, a low, pleading sound deep in his chest. It was the same sound the dog had made the night Ethan had sat in his truck, the engine running in the closed garage, the smell of exhaust filling his head. Major had barked and clawed at the driver's side window until the glass had spider-webbed, his frantic loyalty shattering Ethan's stupor. The dog had saved him then. Maybe he was trying to save him now. With a grunt, Ethan pulled the small pry bar from his tool belt. He'd get this over with, prove to the dog and his son that there was nothing there but dirt and splinters, and then they could get on with the grim business of surviving. The first days were a blur of grueling, mind-numbing labor. Ethan worked from dawn until his muscles screamed in protest, fueled by stale coffee and a grim determination to build a fortress against his own despair. He saw the treehouse not as a home, but as a problem to be solved, a tactical objective. He patched the leaking roof with salvaged sheets of tin, the rhythmic banging of his hammer a stark counterpoint to the forest's quiet hum. He tore out the rotted mattress, burning it in a small, controlled fire that felt cleansing, its smoke carrying away the scent of decay. He scrubbed the floors and walls until his knuckles were raw, battling layers of grime and mildew that seemed to have seeped into the very soul of the wood. Leo, in his own quiet way, began to help. He would gather small, straight twigs for kindling, or sit for hours, sanding a piece of scrap wood until it was smooth as polished stone. The shared silent work began to weave a fragile thread between them, a connection that had frayed in the months of shared grief. Throughout it all, Major's strange behavior continued. The dog seemed to have appointed himself the guardian of a single, unremarkable floorboard. He would lie beside it for hours, his head on his paws, his gaze fixed. If Ethan came near, Major would lift his head, his ears perked, and thump his tail expectantly. Any attempt to cover the spot with a rug or a box was met with a low, persistent growl until the object was removed. It was a bizarre, unwavering obsession. Ethan, preoccupied with making the structure watertight and safe, mostly ignored it. He dismissed it as a quirk, perhaps the scent of a mouse nest trapped beneath the floor. But the dog's focus was relentless. One evening, as a cool rain pattered a soft drumbeat on their new tin roof, Ethan was trying to coax Leo into eating some canned stew. The boy was pushing the food around his plate, his expression vacant. Major, sensing the tension, got up from his post, walked over to Ethan, and nudged the pry bar where it lay on the workbench. He then walked back to the floorboard, stared at it, and let out a single, sharp bark. The directness of the action was startling. It wasn't a random whine or a scratch. It felt like a clear, deliberate communication. Leo looked up from his plate, his fork frozen halfway to his mouth. "He really wants you to look, Dad," he said, his voice a small, rusty whisper. It was the first full sentence he'd volunteered in a month. The words struck Ethan with the force of a physical blow. For his son. He had to do it for his son. All right, you win, you big brute," Ethan said, forcing a weary smile as he ruffled Major's fur. He picked up the pry bar. With Leo and Major watching like a silent, hopeful jury, he wedged the tool into the seam beside the board. The old wood groaned in protest. He put his weight into it, his muscles bunching. There was a loud crack, and the board splintered, but it held fast. It was nailed down tighter than the others, more than nailed. With a final powerful heave, there was a screech of protesting metal, and the board finally gave way, popping loose. Beneath it was not dirt or the joists he expected to see. Instead, there was a dark, hollow space, and nestled inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, metal box. It was an old military-issue ammunition can, its green paint faded, a small padlock securing its latch. A wave of confusion, then a surge of adrenaline washed over Ethan. This wasn't an animal's nest. This was deliberate. This was hidden. Leo crept closer, his eyes wide, with a child's pure wonder. "What is it?" he breathed. Major sniffed the box excitedly, his tail now a blur of motion. He looked up at Ethan, a look of profound satisfaction in his eyes, as if to say, "See? I told you." Ethan lifted the box from its hiding place. It was heavier than it looked. The lock was old and rusted, but it wouldn't stand a chance against a pair of bolt cutters. Suddenly, the crushing weight of their circumstances felt a little less absolute. For the first time in a long time, the future wasn't just a dark, featureless wall. It was a locked box, and he had the tools to open it. The lock surrendered with a dull, satisfying snap. Ethan lifted the heavy lid of the ammo can, a faint scent of oil and old paper rising to meet him. Inside, resting on a bed of yellowed cotton, was a thick, leather-bound journal and a small, intricately carved wooden box. There were no jewels, no stacks of cash, just these two humble objects. A flicker of disappointment passed through him, quickly replaced by a deeper curiosity. He handed the small wooden box to Leo, whose small fingers traced the delicate carvings of leaves and vines that covered its surface. Ethan picked up the journal. The leather was supple and worn smooth with time. There was no name on the cover, no inscription. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was a dense, elegant script. The ink faded from black to a soft brown. The words themselves, however, were gibberish. It was a complex cipher, a cascade of numbers, symbols, and seemingly random letters. A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. Before he was a soldier, he had been a signals intelligence analyst, a codebreaker. His commanders had said he had a gift for seeing the patterns others missed, for finding the logic hidden in chaos. It was a part of his life he had buried long ago, along with the man he used to be. But now, looking at the cryptic pages, he felt a dormant part of his mind stir, the old instincts kicking in. "It's a code," he said, more to himself than to Leo. "It's a book cipher, I think. The key has to be in here somewhere." He carefully examined the contents of the can again. Tucked into a side pocket of the oilcloth wrapping was a single pressed flower, a delicate 5-petaled white orchid he didn't recognize. It was almost translucent with age. Beneath it, a small brass key. It was for the wooden box. Leo looked up, holding the box out to him. "Maybe the key is in here, Dad." With a soft click, Ethan turned the key in the tiny lock. The lid of the wooden box sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was not a key to the cipher, but a set of antique botanist's tools, a small magnifying glass, a pair of fine-tipped tweezers, and a delicate silver scalpel, and beside them a single, perfectly preserved seed, dark and teardrop-shaped. It was confusing. A coded journal, a rare flower, a seed, and a set of dissection tools. It felt like the scattered pieces of a life he couldn't comprehend. For the next 3 days, Ethan became obsessed. He worked on the treehouse during the day, his hands busy, but his mind was miles away, turning over the puzzle of the journal. At night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, with Leo asleep in the newly built bunk bed and Major snoring softly at his feet, he would immerse himself in the code. He tried every common cipher he could remember, Caesar shifts, Vigenère squares, keyword substitutions. Nothing worked. The text remained an impenetrable wall. He was missing the key, the one piece of information that would unlock the rest. Frustrated, he picked up the pressed orchid again, studying it under the small magnifying glass from the box. The cellular structure was beautiful, perfect. On a whim, he turned his attention back to the journal's cover. He ran his fingers over the worn leather, feeling for any imperfection. In the back cover, his thumb brushed against a slight bulge. His heart quickened. Using the tip of the silver scalpel, he carefully pried open the inner lining. Tucked inside was a folded, brittle piece of paper. On it was a drawing of the same orchid, and beside it, a series of notes. Fa uniflora, ghost orchid of the Sierra. Requires specific mycorrhizal fungi symbiosis. Blooms only one night a year, never successfully cultivated. And below that, a short handwritten verse. From the earth, my true north stands. A patient giant in these lands. Count the rings to find my name, and speak the word to start the game. Ethan read the lines again and again. A patient giant, count the rings, find my name. His eyes drifted from the page to the massive trunk of the oak tree that supported their new home. It was the only giant for miles. It had to be the key. The next morning, he found the oldest, clearest cross-section of a fallen limb from the tree. With Leo helping him, they carefully counted the growth rings. It was a slow, painstaking process. They counted 212 rings. 212, Ethan muttered, his mind racing. What name? What word? He thought of his grandparents. His grandmother's name was Eleanor. His grandfather, what was his name? He barely remembered the quiet, stooped man from a handful of childhood visits. Arthur. His name was Arthur. 212. Arthur. He looked at the journal, at the jumble of letters and numbers. What if the key wasn't a word, but a process? What if Arthur and 212 were the variables in the decryption algorithm? He sat down, his hands trembling slightly, and began to work, using the letters of his grandfather's name as a repeating keyword and the number 212 as a letter shift sequence. The first line of gibberish was G2T1N12X2. He applied the new key, G shifted by A1 plus 2 I, T shifted by R18 plus 1 Aharo, N shifted by T20 A2 Ahach, X shifted by H8 to RF. The decrypted letters were nonsensical. He felt a wave of despair. He had been so sure. He was about to give up when he noticed the small hyphenations. G2, T1, N12. What if the numbers weren't shifts, but positions? The second letter of the keyword, the first, the 12th. It was a multi-layered Vigenère cipher, far more complex than he'd first assumed. It would take weeks to break by hand. But as he looked at the first few decoded words, a coherent phrase began to emerge from the noise. My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then my work is complete, but my life is likely over. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a puzzle, it was a story, and he was standing at the very beginning of it. The restoration of the treehouse became Ethan's therapy. Each new floorboard he laid, each window pane he glazed, felt like a small act of reclaiming his own life. The scent of fresh-cut pine began to overpower the old smells of damp and decay. He built sturdy bunk beds for himself and Leo, a small kitchenette with a propane stove, and a rainwater collection system on the roof. The space transformed from a desperate shelter into a marvel of compact, self-sufficient engineering. It became a home, a fortress of their own making, suspended in the quiet embrace of the forest. As the physical structure healed, so did the fragile bond between father and son. Leo began to talk again, his sentences growing longer, his laughter, a sound Ethan feared he'd never hear again, occasionally echoing through the trees. They developed routines, morning coffee for Ethan and hot chocolate for Leo, afternoons spent fishing in the nearby creek, and evenings dedicated to the journal. The deciphering was slow and arduous, a meticulous process of cross-referencing and pattern recognition. But with each decrypted passage, the story of his grandfather, Arthur, unfolded. He was a brilliant botanist, a man far ahead of his time, who had been ridiculed by the academic community for his unconventional theories about plant symbiosis. Cast out, he had retreated to this patch of land to continue his work in secret. The journal spoke of his discovery, the unique orchid, the Far uniflora, which he called the ghost orchid. According to Arthur's notes, the orchid produced a compound, a complex alkaloid that was a super antibiotic. It didn't just kill bacteria, it seemed to neutralize their ability to develop resistance. It was a medical miracle, a discovery that could save millions of lives and be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Arthur was terrified of what would happen if it fell into the wrong hands. He wrote of his research partner, a man named Franklin Finch, who grew increasingly greedy and impatient, pushing to patent and sell the discovery prematurely before its long-term effects could be studied. To learn more, Ethan and Leo made a trip to the small town of Harmony Creek, a place that seemed to have been bypassed by the last 50 years. They needed supplies, and Ethan hoped the local library might have records or old newspapers. Their first stop was the hardware store, a dusty cavern of a place that smelled of oil and fertilizer. The man behind the counter was ancient, with a face like a weathered map and hands gnarled from a lifetime of work. His name tag read Gus. Gus squinted at Ethan. "You're Eleanor's boy, aren't you? Haven't seen you since you were no bigger than a grasshopper. Heard you were staying up at the old place." The casual mention of his grandmother's name was a comfort. "Just my son and me," Ethan said, gesturing to Leo. "We're fixing up the treehouse." Gus nodded slowly. "Good. Shame to let it rot. Your grandfather, Arthur, he built that thing with his own 2 hands. Smartest man I ever knew. Quiet. Folks around here thought he was strange, always out in the woods talking to his plants, but he was a good man, cared about things, not like that partner of his." Ethan's senses went on high alert. "His partner?" Gus leaned on the counter, his voice dropping. "Yeah, city fella. Finch, I think his name was. Sharp suit, slick smile. Used to drive up here in a fancy car. Arthur never trusted him. Said the man only saw the dollar signs, not the wonder of it all. They had a falling out? A bad one. Finch left and never came back. A week later, Arthur had that accident with his truck down by the ravine. Never seemed right to me." The old man's words hung in the air, heavy and dark. An accident. The journal never mentioned an accident. It ended abruptly, with Arthur writing about his plan to hide his research and the seed stock, fearing Finch would return to take it by force. The town librarian, a kind woman named Mrs. Gable, helped Ethan search the archives. They found Arthur's obituary in a yellowed copy of the Harmony Creek Chronicle. It was a small piece, barely a paragraph long, listing the cause of death as a tragic vehicle accident due to brake failure. There was no mention of foul play, no investigation. It was just another sad, forgotten story. But Ethan knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in his bones that it wasn't the whole story. He was no longer just restoring a treehouse or solving a puzzle. He was unearthing a crime, and the name Finch was now seared into his mind. A month after they had moved in, just as the last of the summer heat was giving way to the crisp edge of autumn, a sleek black sedan, utterly alien in the rustic landscape, crunched to a stop at the base of the oak tree. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place on the bed of pine needles. He was in his late 50s, with silvered hair, a confident smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes, and an air of effortless authority. Major, who had been dozing on the platform of the treehouse, rose to his feet, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest. "Easy, boy," Ethan said softly, placing a hand on the dog's back. He felt a prickle of unease. This man wasn't a lost hiker. "Mr. Ethan Hayes," the man called up, his voice smooth and practiced. "My name is Alistair Finch. I'm a senior partner with the Finch Development Group. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Finch. The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. He fought to keep his expression neutral, his heart hammering against his ribs. This had to be Franklin Finch's son. "You can't just drive onto private property, Mr. Finch," Ethan said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. Finch's smile widened, a predatory flash of white. My apologies. I took a chance. You see, my firm has been acquiring land in this region for a new eco-luxury resort, and this beautiful parcel is one of the last holdouts. My father, Franklin Finch, actually knew your grandfather, Arthur. They were old colleagues. The lie was so slick, so effortless, it was almost admirable. He was testing the waters, seeing what Ethan knew. I'm not interested in selling, Ethan said flatly. Finch's gaze swept over the meticulously restored treehouse, a flicker of something, surprise or perhaps annoyance, in his eyes. He had clearly expected to find a derelict property, an owner desperate to sell. Everyone has a price, Mr. Hayes, Finch said, his tone shifting from friendly to transactional. Your grandmother refused our offers for years, but circumstances change. I'm prepared to offer you $500,000, cash. Think of what you could do for your son with that kind of money. A real house, a good school. The mention of Leo was a calculated strike, and it landed. For a dizzying moment, Ethan considered it. $500,000 would solve all their problems. It would be an escape. But then he thought of the journal, of his grandfather's desperate words, of the accident down by the ravine. He thought of the legacy of wonder and caution Arthur had tried to protect. This wasn't just about land anymore. The property is not for sale, Ethan repeated, his voice hard as iron. I'd like you to leave now. For a moment, Finch's mask of civility slipped. A flash of raw anger crossed his face before being quickly suppressed. He had expected a quick, easy transaction, a simple matter of bullying a grieving man into submission. He had miscalculated. A pity, Finch said, his smile now thin and brittle. A man in your position, living in a tree? One would think you'd be more practical. But I'm a patient man. I'll be in touch. He turned and walked back to his car, his movements precise and controlled. As the sedan disappeared down the dirt track, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the faint smell of expensive leather, Ethan knew this was far from over. He had refused the deceptive offer. Now he had to prepare for the inevitable threat. He looked down at the journal in his hands. He was no longer just the keeper of his grandfather's secret. He was its last line of defense. 2 days later, the threat arrived. It wasn't another visit, but a simple manila envelope left propped against the base of the oak tree. There was no note, no return address. Inside were 2 items. The first was a series of high-resolution photographs, taken with a powerful telephoto lens. The first few were of Ethan and Major working on the treehouse, but the last 3 were of Leo. One showed him fishing by the creek, another showed him reading on the platform, and the last, a stomach-churning close-up, showed him sleeping in his bunk, clearly taken through the window at night. The message was unmistakable. We can get to you. We can get to your son. You are not safe here. The second item in the envelope was a single, glossy business card. It read, Alistair Finch, CEO, Finch Biopharmaceuticals. Below the name was a phone number. A cold, familiar rage began to build in Ethan's chest. It was the controlled, focused anger he had learned to channel in the deserts of Afghanistan, a cold fire that burned away fear and doubt, leaving only the sharp, clear lines of the mission. Finch wasn't just a developer, he ran a pharmaceutical company. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Finch didn't want the land for a resort. He wanted his father's stolen discovery. He wanted the orchid. The threat against Leo was a declaration of war. Ethan's hand tightened on the photographs, crumpling them into a tight ball. He went inside, his movements now stripped of all weariness, replaced by a chilling efficiency. Leo was busy sketching in a notebook, Major lying at his feet. Hey, buddy, Ethan said, his voice softer than he felt. How would you like to go on a little camping trip? We'll go see Gus in town for a few days. Leo's eyes lit up. Really? Can Major come? Of course, Ethan said, forcing a smile. He knew Gus and his wife, Martha, a retired nurse, would keep Leo safe. The old man had seen enough in his life to recognize trouble when he saw it, and he had a deep-seated loyalty to Arthur's memory. After dropping a thrilled Leo and a watchful Major off at Gus's farm under the pretense of needing to do some loud work on the treehouse foundation, Ethan drove back to the woods. The silence of the empty treehouse was unnerving. He sat down at his small workbench and dialed the number on Finch's card. It was answered on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call, Mr. Hayes." Finch's voice was smug, dripping with condescending power. "I have your package," Ethan said, his voice flat and cold. "Let's talk about your offer." There was a soft chuckle on the other end. "The $500,000 offer has expired. The new offer is this. You will give me your grandfather's research, the location of the specimens, and the complete seed stock. In return, I will allow you and your son to walk away. You have 24 hours to decide." "And if I don't?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then I will be forced to take them," Finch said, his voice losing all its feigned pleasantry, replaced by a chilling venom. "And I will be much less concerned about the well-being of any squatters I might find on my property. Do you understand me, Mr. Hayes? I will burn that tree to the ground with you in it if I have to. My father spent his life chasing this, and I will not be denied by his partner's sentimental grandson." The line went dead. The threat was no longer veiled. It was raw and absolute. The conflict had escalated from a negotiation to a siege, and Ethan was the only soldier left defending the walls. With the ultimatum delivered, Ethan's world narrowed to a single, sharp point of focus. He had to find the final piece of the puzzle, the truth his grandfather had died to protect. He turned back to the journal, to the last few pages he had yet to fully decipher. They were different from the rest, the code more complex, the handwriting more frantic. Arthur must have written them in the final days, knowing Finch was closing in. Using the new multi-layered key, Ethan worked through the night, the scratching of his pen, the only sound in the silent forest. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose, the final passage revealed itself. It was a confession and a warning. Arthur had discovered that Finch Sr. wasn't just greedy, he was reckless. He had been secretly siphoning small amounts of the raw orchid compound for his own side projects, trying to synthesize a cheap, patentable derivative. The journal described a catastrophic failure in Finch's unauthorized lab, an explosion that had exposed him to a highly concentrated, unstable version of the alkaloid. The exposure had saved him from a latent, aggressive form of cancer, but Arthur suspected it had also triggered a dangerous neurological decay. Then came the final, devastating entry. Arthur had discovered that Finch, through his fledgling pharmaceutical company, was rushing a new line of generic heart medication to market, cutting corners on safety trials to beat his competitors. Arthur had identified a dangerous chemical flaw in the manufacturing process, a contaminant that could cause catastrophic liver failure in a small percentage of patients. He had confronted Finch, who had laughed in his face. Arthur had threatened to go to the authorities. "That was my mistake," Arthur wrote. "I showed him my hand. He knows I have the proof. I fear he will stop at nothing to silence me." The date of that final entry sent a bolt of ice through Ethan's veins. It was 2 days before the accident at the ravine. He now understood. His grandfather hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. But the true horror was yet to come. Finch Biopharmaceuticals. The name echoed in his memory, dredging up a dark and terrible familiarity. He pulled out his laptop and, using the town's weak but usable Wi-Fi signal, he began to search. He typed in the name of the company and the heart medication Clara had been prescribed for her arrhythmia, the one she had taken for 2 years before the sudden, inexplicable collapse of her liver. An avalanche of information filled the screen. Old news articles, class action lawsuit filings, sealed court documents that had been leaked online. It was all there. A massive scandal from 5 years ago. Finch Biopharmaceuticals had knowingly released the faulty medication. Hundreds had been sickened. Dozens had died. The company had paid a massive fine, a slap on the wrist, for a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and Alistair Finch had issued a public apology, blaming a rogue subsidiary. But the damage was done. Clara's name wasn't in the articles, but the timeline, the symptoms, the specific brand of medication, it all matched perfectly. The air left Ethan's lungs. The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't a random tragedy. It wasn't a cruel twist of fate. It was him. Alistair Finch, the man in the tailored suit, the man who had threatened his son, was the same man whose corporate malfeasance, whose greed, had signed his wife's death warrant. The wound he had carried for a year, the raw, gaping hole in his life, suddenly had a face and a name. The fight for his grandfather's legacy and the quest for justice for his wife were now one and the same. The stakes were no longer about money or a scientific discovery. They had become fused with the deepest pain of his life. This was not about defense anymore. This was about retribution. A cold, precise calm settled over him. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't a grieving husband anymore. He was a soldier, and Alistair Finch had just become his target. The choice was a simple one, but the cost was immense. Ethan could take the journal, the seed, and run, disappear, live his life looking over his shoulder, forever a fugitive from a man who had already taken everything from him. Or he could stay. He could fight. He could use the skills that had haunted his dreams for years, the very training that felt stained with loss, and turn them into tools of justice. He looked around the treehouse at the home he had built with his own hands, a sanctuary born from wreckage. He thought of Leo, safe at Gus's farm, and of Clara's fading photograph tucked into his wallet. Running was not an option. Surrender was unthinkable. He was making his stand here. The next 12 hours were a masterclass in tactical preparation. Ethan's mind, once clouded by grief, was now sharp, every thought and action honed by years of special forces training. The forest was no longer just his home. It became his ally, his weapon. He wasn't just protecting a treehouse, he was fortifying a castle. He started with the perimeter. Using skills he hadn't used in a decade, he constructed a series of non-lethal traps and early warning systems. He rigged tripwires made of fishing line to sets of hanging tin cans that would create a racket if disturbed. He dug shallow pits filled with mud and wet leaves along the most likely paths of approach, not to injure, but to slow and disorient. He used the natural terrain to his advantage, creating choke points and false trails. The treehouse itself became the heart of his defense. He reinforced the single door, bracing it with a heavy log. He rigged the pulley system he'd used to lift supplies so that it could drop a heavy cargo net filled with firewood, a formidable obstacle for anyone trying to climb the main ladder. He filled buckets with sand and water to douse any potential fires. He was transforming his sanctuary into a fortress, his tools of creation into instruments of defense. His most ingenious preparation involved the treehouse's new lighting system. He had run a simple solar-powered electrical line for a few LED bulbs. Now he repurposed it. He took the high-powered flashlight he owned, the kind with a disorienting strobe function, and mounted it above the main platform, aimed directly at the top of the ladder. He wired it to a hidden switch he could operate from inside. Anyone climbing into the light would be momentarily blinded and disoriented, giving him a crucial advantage. He gathered his grandfather's research, the journal, the notes, the pressed orchid, and the precious seed, and placed them back in the metal ammo can. He then secured the can to a rope and lowered it into a hollow he'd discovered in a separate nearby tree, camouflaging the opening with bark and moss. The prize would not be in the fortress. As darkness fell, a deep and profound silence descended upon the woods. Ethan sat in the dim light of a single lantern, cleaning his old service pistol, the familiar weight of it a grim comfort in his hands. He hoped he wouldn't have to use it. His plan was about evasion, capture, and exposure, not bloodshed. He was a protector, not a killer, not anymore. but he was also a realist. He knew men like Finch didn't come alone, and they didn't come to talk. The costly choice had been made. He had chosen to turn his grief into a weapon, his home into a battlefield. He was risking everything, not for a fortune, but for a chance at a justice the world had denied him, a final, defiant act of love for the woman he had lost. He was ready. Let them come. The sound came just after midnight, a faint crack of a twig breaking under a heavy foot. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Ethan's trained ears, it was as loud as a gunshot. They were here. He moved to the window, peering into the inky blackness. He saw nothing, but he could feel them, a disturbance in the forest's natural rhythm. A moment later, one of his perimeter alarms went off, a frantic, metallic clatter of tin cans from the east. They were clumsy. Good. He heard a muffled curse, then silence. They were trying to be quiet now, but they had already announced their arrival. He counted the seconds, his breathing slow and even. He moved to the far side of the treehouse and saw them, 3 dark figures moving through the trees, using the shadows as cover. They were armed, carrying what looked like crowbars and heavy bolt cutters. Finch wasn't with them. This was his cleanup crew. The men reached the base of the oak tree, their forms coalescing into a single, menacing group. One of them, a large, broad-shouldered man who seemed to be the leader, looked up at the treehouse, then gestured for one of his companions to start climbing the ladder. Ethan's hand hovered over the switch for the strobe light. He waited, letting the man get 3/4 of the way up, his confidence growing with each rung. Now. He flipped the switch. A blinding, pulsating blast of light erupted from the platform, turning the night into a strobing, disorienting nightmare. The man on the ladder cried out, shielding his eyes, his foot slipping. He dangled for a second before crashing heavily to the ground. The 2 men below scattered, momentarily confused and blinded by the after-images. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled the release for the cargo net. With a whoosh and a heavy thud, the net full of firewood dropped, landing squarely on top of one of the remaining men, pinning him to the ground in a tangle of rope and heavy logs. 2 down, 1 to go. The leader, recovering from the light, let out a roar of rage and charged for the tree trunk itself, ignoring the ladder, trying to climb the thick, gnarled bark. He was strong, agile, and desperate. Ethan knew he would reach the platform in seconds. As the man's hands gripped the edge of the platform, Ethan was there to meet him. He didn't use his gun. He used a simple, well-aimed kick to the man's chest, a technique designed to break a charge, not to injure. The man grunted, his grip failing, and he tumbled back to the forest floor, landing with a groan. Silence. It was over. But Ethan knew it wasn't. This was just the opening act. From the shadows near the edge of the clearing, a 4th figure emerged. It was Alistair Finch. He wasn't dressed for combat. He was still in a suit, but he held a pistol, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "Impressive, Mr. Hayes," Finch said, his voice dangerously calm as he stepped over his groaning employee. "A real soldier, but soldiers can be beaten." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Ethan. "Now, you are going to tell me where the research is, all of it." At that exact moment, a new sound cut through the tension, the sound of an engine. Headlights sliced through the darkness as Gus's old pickup truck barreled down the dirt track, coming to a screeching halt. Gus swung out of the driver's side, a shotgun held firmly in his hands. But it wasn't Gus that Finch stared at. It was the passenger door. It flew open, and out of it shot a 70-pound blur of black and tan fur. Major. The dog had been whining and clawing at the door ever since Ethan had left, Gus explained later. He knew. He had sensed the danger. Major didn't hesitate. He saw the gun in Finch's hand, saw the threat to his master. With a ferocious bark that was more lion than dog, he launched himself through the air. He hit Finch square in the chest, the impact throwing the man off balance. The pistol fired, the shot going wild, whistling harmlessly into the night sky. Finch went down hard, the breath knocked out of him, the gun skittering away into the leaves. Major stood over him, teeth bared, a deep menacing growl, a clear promise of what would happen if Finch moved a muscle. The fight was over, and loyalty, in the form of a magnificent German shepherd, had won. The arrival of the local sheriff, summoned by Gus on his cell phone, turned the chaotic scene into a methodical investigation. Finch and his hired thugs, one with a sprained ankle and all three with bruised egos, were taken into custody. The story they tried to spin about being lost and simply inquiring about a property purchase fell apart under the sheriff's skeptical questioning and the undeniable evidence of their equipment and Ethan's defensive preparations. The real victory, however, was not in the arrests, but in the contents of the ammo can. With Gus and the sheriff as witnesses, Ethan retrieved his grandfather's journal. He explained the code, the story of the ghost orchid, and the murder of his grandfather. But the most damning evidence was the final entry, Arthur's detailed account of Finch Sr.'s recklessness and his specific dated warning about the faulty heart medication produced by Finch Biopharmaceuticals. When cross-referenced with the public records of the subsequent scandal and the timeline of Clara's illness and death, it formed an undeniable chain of cause and effect. Alistair Finch wasn't just guilty of trespassing and assault. He was the head of a corporation whose criminal negligence had led to his wife's death. Armed with this new, explosive evidence, the old class action lawsuit was reopened, and a new federal investigation was launched into both Finch Biopharmaceuticals and the suspicious death of Arthur Hayes 4 decades earlier. Finch's empire, built on a foundation of theft and deceit, crumbled. The full story came out. Arthur's research, when analyzed by a modern lab, was even more revolutionary than he had known. The compound from the ghost orchid didn't just fight bacteria. It promoted cellular regeneration in a way science had never seen. It was a discovery that would change medicine forever, valued at well over the $500 million Finch had been willing to kill for. Ethan, as Arthur's sole heir, was suddenly in control of a monumental legacy and a staggering fortune. But the money meant little to him. It couldn't bring back Clara, and it couldn't erase the years of grief. He knew what he had to do. 6 months later, the Clara Hayes Foundation for Ethical Research and Patient Advocacy opened its doors, funded entirely by the profits from the synthesized orchid. Compound, its mission was twofold: to fund independent, transparent medical research, free from corporate greed, and to provide financial and legal support to families who, like his, had been devastated by pharmaceutical negligence. He had turned his pain into a shield for others. The treehouse, once a symbol of his lowest point, was now a cherished home. He and Leo still lived there, not out of necessity, but out of love for the quiet strength of the woods and the memory of the man who had built it. Ethan had come to this place a broken man, running from a past he couldn't face. He had found not only justice for his grandfather and his wife, but he had found himself again. He had rebuilt his life, plank by plank, just as he had rebuilt the small wooden fortress in the arms of the great oak, a testament to the idea that even from the deepest wreckage, a new and stronger life can grow. The truest measure of a person's character is not how they face their enemies, but how they care for their own. In the end, it was a chain of unwavering loyalty, a grandfather's love for his legacy, a father's fierce protection of his son, and a dog's profound devotion to his master that unraveled a decades-old injustice and healed a broken family. It teaches us that healing is not a passive process of waiting for wounds to fade, but an active one of building, of fighting for what is right, and of turning our deepest pain into a source of strength and purpose for others. We hope this story resonated with you. What did you think of Major's incredible intuition and bravery? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would be honored to read your story. Your engagement helps our community grow, so please consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who might need a story of hope. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Thank you for being with us.